So we're going to be starting a series today that's going to take us through most of the summer, actually all the way through the rest of the summer for the most part. The series is about how Jesus uses the phrase, I am. So in the book of John, there are certain times where Jesus is explaining who he is, he's giving his identity, and he uses the phrase, I am, and then he explains something about himself. And so what we're going to do over the next several weeks is look at some of those individual verses where Jesus says, I am, and then explains something about his character. Why are we doing that? Well, the number one reason we're doing that is because if we want to know Jesus, we want to know who he really is, we should take him for his word, not what everyone else is saying about him. Because I hear a lot of phrases like, I like to think of Jesus as, and then they'll say something, and you're like, that's not it at all. That's not correct. That's not accurate. But we want to take Jesus at his word. We want to see what he has to say about himself. That's how we're going to understand and know who Jesus really is. So we're going to look at it because, number one, if we want to know a man, we should take him at his word. The other reason we're going to do that is because that phrase that he uses is actually very important. It's not some sort of I am type of statement that we usually make, like I am a Detroit Tigers fan, or I am this, or I am that. It is a statement actually that ties him back to God. So when we remember the story of the burning bush, remember how Moses is out wandering around and all of a sudden he comes across this bush that's on fire but doesn't burn, and then the bush starts talking to him and he just reacts by like responding to it. But when he's talking to, and this turns out to be God, when he's talking to God in that instance, he asks him, what should I tell people your name is? And God's response is, I am who I am. Say that I am has sent me to you. And so when Jesus uses the phrase I am in John, he's going back to that understanding of, you remember when God said his name? Oh yeah, by the way, I am God. And I'm here. And I'm going to tell you who I am. And that was a very important phrase because in Egypt, they had a God for everything, basically. They had a God for the sun. They had a God for the water. They had a God for all these different things. And what separated their understanding of God and the Jewish understanding of God is they had a God for everything. They gave their God a name, and they were limited in their power. But when Jesus says, I am, and back in the day when God says, I am to Moses, what he's saying is, you don't name me, I tell you who I am. What he's saying is, I'm not a God of something, I'm a God of everything. He is self-sufficient. He is all-powerful. He is the only true God. And when Jesus is on the scene and he's saying, I am, he's essentially saying, oh yeah, by the way, God showed up. I'm standing right in front of you. You better pay attention to what I have to say. And we're going to find out when we read John 8 today, they didn't get it. When he says something about himself and he uses this phrase, I am, he's explaining his deity, he's explaining who he is and how much life is about to change for them. They didn't understand. They didn't get it. So today we're going to be looking at John chapter 8. So if you turn your Bibles to John 8, and let me give you some encouragement as we go through these passages. There's a lot here. And for the sake of time and for the sake of being able to cover things, we can't cover every verse. So my encouragement to you is take John 8 home with you this week and read through it slowly, read through it carefully so that you get the big picture of what he's saying. So I'm going to give you the groundwork. I'm going to give you the broad framework of what this means when Jesus says in John chapter 8, I am the light of the world. But to fully appreciate it, to fully understand it, I would encourage you to read through John 8 this week as you get a chance to see the big picture of things. So here's the first thing we need to realize when we talk about Jesus being the light of the world. The first thing we need to keep in mind is that there was light long before there was darkness. There was light long before there was darkness. When we consider what Jesus says here in John chapter 8, we need to keep things in perspective. We need to recognize and realize that there is both light and darkness in this world. And that's not hard to realize. It's not hard to understand. But sometimes we get overwhelmed by the darkness that we forget that there's still light. Sometimes we can be so overwhelmed by the darkness that we see on the news and all the stories that we hear about all these bad things that happen that we can forget and miss that there is still light in this world. Even little things are good gifts from God that can be taken for granted, and we don't realize how good they are until we miss them. For example, good health. Every day when we wake up and we have good health, we don't think too much about that. But when we wake up and we're not feeling so good, we realize how valuable our health is. We realize how important it was that we were able to wake up and feel good that day and get around and do the things that we are called to do. One thing you guys started to realize recently, clean air is a gift. How many of you realize that, the AQI thing or the quality index of the air, that had some issues for us not too long ago. Let me tell you something. Those are actually considered good days in China. Meaning like the worst day that we had here is what we call a picnic day in China, meaning we would go outside and enjoy the day because that's clean air for them. But we don't think about clean air too much. But when we had dirty air, when we had messed up air, when things were not so good, suddenly realized, we had something good. But we didn't think about it because it became routine. There is beauty in this world that we often take for granted. Think about how God created things. He created us with the ability to see colors. And I don't see them the way my wife sees them. Everything's red. She's like crimson, vermilion, whatever. We see things a little bit differently, but we can see colors. We enjoy the beauty of a sunset. We were in Michigan last week. The sun didn't set till like 10:40, so it was a long time waiting for the sunset to come, but we got to see it over Lake Superior and see the sun going down. We take taste for granted. God could allow us to come to a place where we eat food just to survive without any sense of taste, without any sense of enjoyment. But we enjoy a good meal because God gave us the ability to taste. There's good things that we have. And even better, God puts people in our lives. A good meal with good friends is a gift from God. There's light in this world. There's good things that we can be thankful for. But there is also darkness. Famine exists. Maybe not in our tables, but sometimes in our world. Racism exists. We may not see it, but it's felt by people. Human trafficking exists, and it's not outside of Mifflin County necessarily. We had a girl from our church in North Carolina, small town, Bible Belt, who went missing for a couple weeks. She actually was found in Pennsylvania because someone on the internet kind of convinced her that he was a good guy, picked her up in a car and drove her up here. These things exist, and it's not always somewhere out there. Drug addiction exists. Child abuse happens way more than we want to admit. Children and youth are very busy people. There are a lot of issues that we see happening in the world. And sometimes what we find and what we realize is light and darkness sometimes exist in the same moment because of how people respond. What happened in Mifflintown with the police and the shooting that happened there, that's darkness. That's evil. But what was the response? Light. So sometimes in the midst of bad things that happen, we can be overwhelmed by the darkness, but sometimes when the darkness shows up, that's when the light starts to shine even brighter. And those things can sometimes coexist in the same place. If we only look at the darkness in the world, we are going to feel absolutely hopeless. If we have a pessimistic view that everything's bad, everything's terrible, there's no good in the world anymore, we're going to live our lives hopeless. But if we pretend that there is no darkness, that everything's good and everything's fine, we will end up being absolutely useless Christians. We need to understand there is light and dark, there is good and evil. We need to be aware of this. But at the same time, we also need to understand that the world wasn't always this way. The world was created good. It was created perfect and declared very good by God. Darkness came into the world. It wasn't created into the world. Meaning when God was there creating the world, he didn't put evil and suffering and all these things into it. That came a little bit later. Think about this. Satan himself once was standing in the light, in heaven, in the presence of God. And yet he somehow came to the point where he realized, I think I want to be like God. Not only do I want to be like God, I want to be God. And started stepping into the shadows. And all of a sudden, darkness overcomes him. And he convinced angels, up to a third of the angels, to step into the darkness with him. And they get cast out of heaven. And then they come to the earth. And what is Satan's number one goal? Bring darkness into the world. So he goes to Adam and Eve and he tries to convince them. Oh yeah, God says all this stuff. He gave you all these commands. God's not really on your side. He's trying to make himself better than you. So why don't you do what you want to do, and you'll see that there will be a light that you can't even recognize right now. And so Adam and Eve are tempted, and they, by their free will, given to sin, and what they expected to see as light, all of a sudden shines a darkness that they did not expect. And we've been living in that darkness ever since. There is good and there is evil. There is light and there is darkness. But the light has existed a lot longer than the darkness, and the light's going to last forever. The darkness will not. So that's where we find hope. In John chapter 8, verses 54 through 59, we're going to see that he shows something to the people that doesn't make sense to them, but it's a sort of a reminder that that light exists a lot longer than this darkness that we see. See, Jesus replied, "If I glorify myself, my glory means nothing. My Father, whom you claim as your God, is the one who glorifies me. Though you do not know him, I know him. If I said I did not, I would be a liar like you. But I do know him, and I obey his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad." And then they basically are saying, like, you're putting yourself in the days of Abraham. That doesn't make sense. So here's their statement. "You are not yet 50 years old," they said, "and you have seen Abraham?" Jesus replied, "Very truly I say, before Abraham was born, I am." At this they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. What he's saying is, even before Abraham, I was there. I existed. I was light. Even before the darkness came in, I was there. I existed. I was light. He was around a lot longer than they realized. He was there before the creation of the world, and each of those days as creation unfolded, he was part of that. He was aware when Adam and Eve chose to disobey God and brought darkness into this world. Though darkness came into the world, God was still light. Even though there was darkness starting to pop up, and we see this throughout the books of the Old Testament, even though there was this darkness that was coming in, God's light did not get extinguished. The sun was there when God made a covenant with Abraham and said he would bless all nations through his descendant, knowing full well that the descendant that was going to be the blessing was him. And he was going to bring light to the world. In the fullness of time and into a darkened world full of sin and hopelessness, Jesus, the light of the world, comes bringing light that makes people more aware of the sin and the darkness in their lives and allows them to step into what is true and right and good. So there is light and there is darkness, but the darkness started a whole lot later than the light existed. The light's always been there. God has always been good. He created everything good. And then things started to fall when sin came into the world. Satan brings into the world deception and darkness. Deception because he disguises darkness as light. Think about this. Evil is not always seen for what it really is. If Satan told you the truth about sin, you wouldn't sin. If Satan told you the truth about what drinking alcohol could do to your life, you probably wouldn't start drinking. If he told you the truth about what having affairs would do to your marriage, you probably wouldn't consider that. If he told you about all the problems that come with the choices that you make, you would say, no, thank you. But what does he do? He deceives us by explaining to us things in a way that makes it seem better than it is. Explaining in a way that seems like a light. We must realize that as much as Satan tries to spread darkness, the light of God will never be extinguished. The only way the light of God starts to dim is if we turn the lights out and say, you know what, we don't want you here anymore. His light's not going to stop shining. We have to remove him. We have to kick him out. We have to say, we don't want you to be part of this anymore. And what happens when you turn the light of God out in a place? Public schools at some point decided, we don't want God here so much anymore. Let's kind of cut back on the God talk. So they turns the light out. Is anyone pleased with what the result was? Do you know what the biggest draw to our school, Juniata Christian School, is? We like your school because there's still light. We don't like the darkness we see there. And even in the midst of that, even as like some of the things have changed, there's still light in our schools. We have Christian teachers who are there making a difference. We still have something called release time where kids can get out of school. So even in the best attempts to say, like, we need to separate things, God's still shining. The light's still there. In the future, light and darkness will be separated. There will be light in heaven, but hell is described as utter darkness. So at some point in time, this light and darkness, this good and evil that kind of is mixed up in this world, there's going to be a separation. And that's going to be the change that we look forward to. But at the same time, we cannot allow ourselves to not be light today. There's two different lights existing in this world today, I would say. There's a light like this, which is actually good and useful. This is the way the light of God shines. It illuminates things. It allows us to see things clearly. It brings to light things maybe that we didn't see before. But Satan's kind of shining a light too. This is what I call the Satan light. Okay, this is the Satan light here. It looks like a light, doesn't it? But what is the end result of someone who goes to this light? Zap. I heard this a lot over our vacation. We had this actually set up in the place we were staying, and all night long you heard zip, zip. That is exactly what Satan's light is like, though. It looks like a light, and it draws you in, but you do not want to get too close, because if you do, it only leads to destruction. Proof of that was every morning when I had to empty the tray out with all the dead bugs. But Satan is like that. He will shine a light, but it's not the type of light that we want to be attracted to. But to some people, it looks good. But he doesn't tell them what happens when you get too close. He will never tell us what happens when we get too close to sin. But when Jesus shines a light, we start to realize, oh, that's not so good. Oh, this is not helpful. This is destructive. Here's the other thing that we know is the light is not always seen clearly by everyone. Look at chapter 8, verse 12. It says, when Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Jesus makes a big declaration here. He says, I am, again, that is him saying deity. He's claiming to be God. I am the light of the world. The light of the world, he came to illuminate and show what is right and true and good to people. But it says to the world, meaning it's not just for the Jewish people. They were expecting Messiah to come, and they thought they had plans for him. But when he comes to the world, he says, I'm not light just for you guys. I'm the light of the world. I'm here to change everything for everyone. Now, light in Jewish thought, the idea of light, symbolizes the holiness of God. So for them, light meant God is good, he is perfect, he is holy, he's attractive, he's what we should aspire to follow, or he is the one we should aspire to follow. What's interesting about Jesus is we don't sometimes think about his timing on things, but his timing is purposeful often. And in this case, he says, I am the light of the world at a very specific time. It's called the Festival of Shelters or the Feast of Tabernacles. And during this particular festival, when he chooses to make the declaration that he is the light of the world, he is standing in an area where they have lit these huge lanterns for the festival. And those lanterns lit up the whole city. It was actually a time where they would light these lanterns as a reminder that when they came out of slavery in Egypt, God led them as a pillar of fire. So it's not a coincidence that Jesus chose this occasion, this particular time, and this particular location around these giant lights illuminating the city to say, I am the light of the world. And when he says it, he's pointing out and reminding them, you're celebrating your freedom from slavery in Egypt. A light's about to shine to bring you out of slavery, but it's not slavery to Egypt. It's slavery to sin. What does he go on to say? He says, basically, if you follow me, you won't live in darkness anymore. If you see the light, you follow what's there, you don't have to live in this darkness anymore. I am the light of the world, not a light, but the light, the only true and dependable light. Follow me. That's an invitation. Follow me. It's not a light that just shines because it's there. It's this light that shines because we choose to see it and accept it and follow it. Follow me and you will not live in darkness. The people had God in flesh standing among them. The long-awaited Messiah has come to them, and they still don't know what's happening. And they're a little bit upset because even though Jesus spoke the truth, they didn't take him at his word because you're supposed to have two witnesses. They were expecting another witness to make this valid. Verse 13 and 14. So this is John 8, 13 and 14. The Pharisees challenged him. Here you are appearing as your own witness. Your testimony is not valid. So Jesus says, I am the light of the world. We say, we don't believe you. One witness is not enough. So then Jesus calls him to account for that. He answered, even if I testify on my own behalf, my testimony is valid. Meaning, God can testify for himself. He knows what he's talking about. For I know where I come from, and I know where I'm going. But you have no idea where I come from or where I'm going. You judge by human standards. I pass judgment on no one. But if I do judge, my decisions are true because I am not alone. I stand with the Father who sent me. In your own law it is written that the testimony of two witnesses is true. I am the one who testifies for myself. My other witness is the Father who sent me." Then they asked him, "Where is your Father?" "You do not know me or my Father," Jesus replied. "If you knew me, you would know my Father also." He spoke these words while teaching in the temple courts near the place where the offerings were put. Yet no one sees him because his hour had not yet come. So he's saying, I speak on my own behalf. I am God. You should just listen to what I have to say. And he says, if you don't believe me, my Father testifies for me. But then he points out something. You don't know me or my Father. Who is he talking to? Were these some sort of Gentiles who've never heard of God before? No, these are the Pharisees. And what he's saying is, you Pharisees, these guys who claim to work for God, these guys who claim to speak on behalf of God, have the Son of God standing in front of him, and they're like, we don't know who you are. And what he says to them is, if you don't know me, you don't know my Father. You claim to work on behalf of God, but you don't really know God. You Pharisees are getting it wrong. You think you're in the right place. You think you're doing the right thing, but you don't even know what's happening. He calls out their relationship status. You don't know me, you don't know my Father. You have rules and rituals, but you have no relationship. And you don't really know God like you think you do. See, here's the reality. The Pharisees knew about God, or at least they thought they did. But when Jesus shows up on the scene and they don't realize who he is, turns out they didn't really know him all that well. When he shines a light on what's happening, when he shines a light on what is right and true and good, and he calls them to account for what's happening in their teaching and how they're living, and they call him out on doing things, they're like, you're sinful. You shouldn't do that anymore. Every time he responds to them, he's starting to make him realize, your relationship with God is not what you thought it was. You don't know me or my Father. They saw God in the flesh and chose to hate him and oppose him because the light he shined revealed the darkness that existed, and they didn't like to see that darkness. So instead of cleaning up their mess, they'd rather get rid of the light. Think about that. The Pharisees challenged Jesus because they didn't like the way he was doing things. They didn't like the fact that he was challenging their power, challenging their authority. They didn't like the fact that he was upending what had always been to point something better and new and good. So instead of just being humble and saying, maybe we should listen to this guy, they said, no, let's get rid of him. My question for us today is this. If Jesus showed up in the flesh, would we like to hear what he has to say to us? The Pharisees had Jesus show up in the flesh, God himself standing in front of them, and they did not like what they heard. They did not like what he had to say about them and what was happening. If Jesus showed up in the flesh, would we consider his ways too difficult or challenging to our status quo? If Jesus showed up and called out the darkness in our lives, would we resist him or clean up our mess? Because when Jesus shows up and says, we need to get things fixed, I'm here to set you free from sin, they said, no thanks, we'd rather stay where we're at. Jesus shines a light. They didn't like what they saw, so they tried to shut the light out. And that is the question we need to think about. When the light of Christ shines in our lives, when he reveals things to us, do we resist change? Or do we say, you know what, I'm going to clean up this mess? Do we know Jesus? Not just know about Jesus, do we actually know Jesus? Because these Pharisees, they claim to know God. They claim to work for God. But when God in the flesh shows up, they didn't get it, and they rejected him. I think of an example as I was trying to write this message. We were on vacation. Courtney's family has a cabin in the Upper Peninsula. It is her favorite place on earth. She loves that cabin, and I love Courtney, so I went to the cabin. The cabin is an acquired taste that I've tried for 20 years to acquire, and I'm still working on it. But while we were at the cabin, they were out, and I was working on this, and I went into the bathroom, and it's like completely dark in there. I just turned a light on, and when I turned a light on, there was a mouse on a shelf staring at me. Okay, my reaction to that was, okay, take my hat off. I'm going to beat that mouse. And I ended up, tearing up some of the bathroom a little bit. I was knocking. Glad Courtney was not there at the time. I was, doing all this stuff to try to get this mouse, right? Didn't get it. I failed miserably at trying to get the mouse. So after that point, every time I went to turn the light on, I was like, there's a mouse in here. I'm going to turn this stupid light on. There's going to be a mouse right there. Until later that evening, the mouse was in the trap. So that after that was happening, after that mouse was now accounted for, let's say, the mouse is accounted for. From that point on, turning the light on was not that big a deal because I knew what had happened. I knew that it had been dealt with. Probably more mice there. I didn't like to think about that fact. But my problem had been dealt with. Here's the reality. When Jesus shines a light in our life, we either can choose to say, let's turn the light off and pretend like we didn't see anything, and let's be afraid to turn the light on every time we go in there, or we could deal with the problems. And we could say, let's keep the light on, let's clean up the mess, let's deal with things. The Pharisees had the opportunity to change their lives, and they chose not to. Instead of accepting freedom that came from Christ, they put him to death. Because they'd rather shut him up than change their lives. When the light of Christ shines, we need to make a choice. Are we going to say, you know, I didn't like what I see, I'm going to panic and I'm going to freak out, and I don't want to ever turn the light on again? Or are we going to deal with the problems? Are we going to deal with the mess? See, we're called to live in the light, not in the darkness. We're called to live in the light. And once we are in the light, we must avoid the shadows. So once we come to faith, once the light of Christ comes into our life, we must make sure that we live carefully and not allow ourselves the temptation to creep back into the shadows. Remember, John 8:12, whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Jesus leads us into the light, but sometimes we allow ourselves to drift into the shadows. Sometimes, even though the right path is lit up, we have the lamp on and we see where we're supposed to be going. Sometimes we say, maybe I think I want to go a different route. I know what is right, but I'm going to choose this way instead. We deal with things. This is an issue that even though we have been set free from sin and have the light of truth, we will sometimes choose to live in shadowy places. Or we don't deal with all of our issues in life and we allow some things to stay hidden. How many of you have places in your house like when guests show up, you're like, okay, well, we need to shut that door to that room because that's a mess still. We don't want to see them in there. Like our house is kind of like that. Our kitchen, you can see from our front door. And when someone knocks unexpectedly, my wife's always like, shut the kitchen door. The dishes aren't cleaned yet. Because you can see the mess in there. So we shut the door so that we don't have anyone seeing the mess in our lives. And that's what happens when we live in shadowy places. We have things that we say, I want God to handle this. I want to deal with this in my life. This is mine. I'm going to keep it for myself, and I don't want anyone to see it. John 8:31-38, Jesus is going to explain something to these people. It says, to the Jews who had believed, Jesus said, if you hold my teaching, you are really my disciple. So what is a sign of being a disciple of Jesus? Obedience to his word. Being a follower of Jesus is not about claiming on some sort of survey, do you believe that there's a God? It's what most people think Christianity is. I believe there's a God and I'm not an atheist. I'm not a Muslim. So I'm a Christian. But Jesus says if you're a disciple, it's seen in how you live. It's seen in what you do in obedience to what I have to say. It's living in the light. They answered him, we are Abraham's descendants and have never been slaves of anyone. How can you say that we shall be set free? So what Jesus says is, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. And they're like, we're not slaves. What are you talking about? We're free already. He was saying something about sin in their lives, and they were talking about actual slavery. Oddly enough, they actually felt like slaves in some ways because they hated the Romans who had occupied their territory. So they had some level of understanding. Jesus replied, very truly, I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now, a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So if son sets you free, you will be free indeed. I know that you are Abraham's descendants, yet you are looking for a way to kill me because you have no room for my word. I am telling you what I've seen in the Father's presence, and you are doing what you have heard from your father. He said, my father, that's capitalized. He's saying God, and he's saying what you're doing is from your father. That's not capitalized. He's saying that's from Satan. So Jesus shines the light and says, you can be free from all this mess, all this sin. You don't have to live in sin anymore. And they're saying, we don't want to hear about that. We're going to do our own thing. Leave us alone. Jesus says we've been set free from sin and we do not need to sin anymore. Yet why do we struggle with sin? We've been set free, yet people still sin. It's because the pride and selfishness that Adam and Eve felt that allowed them to sin in the first place doesn't completely erase from our lives. And sometimes that creeps back in. Why do we still sin? I think sometimes it's because of our mindset. We claim that we're humans and we're going to sin and we're going to make mistakes, so we just allow it to happen. The idea that because I'm a human and I'm going to make mistakes, sometimes it also sounds like a lot of permission to just be human at that point in time. Or we claim that sometimes we would never do this. So we look at sin in people's lives and we say, I would never do that. I would never commit that sin. And every time we say, I would never do that, we let our guard down. Every time we say, I would never sin like that, I would never do these things, we let our guard down and we're not prepared. Sometimes we claim that we are weak. We claim that we can't win. But that is not what Jesus said. Jesus said we're victorious in him. He didn't say, good luck in your struggle with sin, maybe you'll make it. What he's saying is, if the Son sets you free, you are free indeed. You do not have to sin anymore. And I think sometimes our biggest problem is we don't prepare for battle. We just walk right into it. So my son is training with the National Guard today. He had to be there at 7 in the morning in Duncansville. He's got a 50-pound backpack that he's going to have to carry for a 5-mile hike. That's just part of their preparation. Why is he doing that? Is it because they expect war? Or is it because if war comes, they're going to be ready for it? See, there's this confidence sometimes that we have. We say, I'm a Christian, I would never sin. So we don't prepare for battle. We just step into things. We just walk into it. I would never do that. I'm a Christian. Why are they training for something they don't know is going to happen? It's because they want to be prepared. Because you win battles before the battle begins. You win battles long before you step onto the battlefield. If we want to be free from sin, we need to understand that victory doesn't start with temptation. Victory starts with preparation. Victory starts with understanding our strengths and weaknesses, knowing what's going to be tempting to us, avoiding circumstances sometimes. It's surrounding ourselves with people who are going to hold us to account, putting our minds to God's word. How do you get victory in your life? Is you put more of God's light into it than you do the darkness of the world. And that comes with the choices we make for entertainment, the choices for people that we spend our time with, the things that we value. We will be free from sin because God says we're going to be free from sin. But you don't fight the battle by just walking into a landmine. You fight the battle by preparation, by knowing that Satan is trying to trick you. Satan's got a plan for you too. Does God have a plan for your life? Yep. Does Satan have a plan for your life? Yeah. But his plan is not a good plan. And his plan is to try to distinguish this, put this light out. He wants to cut the power to this so that we don't see that light anymore. Christians don't walk in darkness, but we better be aware of the shadows we allow into our lives. We don't walk in darkness, but we better be aware of shadowy places. Jesus said he is the light of the world, but he also says something to his followers. Jesus says, I am the light of the world, but he also says to his followers, you are the light of the world. I am the light of the world, claims Jesus, but then he says to his people, you are also the light of the world. Jesus is the light of the world. His followers are the light of the world. We find that in Matthew chapter 5, verse 14. So here's my question for you. If we sit around and complain about darkness, we must ask the question, which source of light has dimmed to allow the darkness to grow? Because darkness only works if the light doesn't shine. Darkness can't overtake light if the light source doesn't extinguish. Meaning, unless I do this light's going to stay on. There's two light sources. He says, I am the light of the world. He says, you are the light of the world. We shine as Jesus works in our life. So if there's more darkness and the light starts to be dimming, who's the problem? Is it the I am or is it the you are part of that? Because I guarantee you the I am the light of the world has not changed, has not dimmed, has not gone dull. What about the you are the light of the world part? If we don't like darkness, we better shine a light. The only way to fight against darkness is with light. And the only way that darkness wins is if we choose not to be light. or if we choose to contain the light in certain areas. If we claim the world is growing darker and we are the light of the world, we better deal with our shadows before we start worrying about the darkness of the world. Think about it. If we spent just a little bit of time not complaining about the world, the country, politics, all these different things, what if we spend our first amount of time saying, let's fix us? Let's deal with the darkness in our churches. Let's deal with the darkness in our hearts, the shadowy places that are there. If we fix that first and we have a bright light shining, how much of a difference is that going to make to our community, to our world? If we claim that the world is growing dark and we are the light of the world, we better start shining brighter, or we better not complain about the darkness. I think of my cell phone light. How many of you sometimes use your light on your cell phone? Honestly, I've never used the light on my cell phone because every time I need this stupid thing, it's at 10% of battery and it doesn't turn on. It is a useless light because it does not have the power to make it work. And the church will be an absolutely useless light if we do not have the power to shine like we're supposed to. How do we get fully charged? Connecting with God, prayer, being here, actually following through with the commitments that we make to honor and serve Him. We have all the tools necessary to change the world. We have all the tools necessary to bring light to our community. Well, you better check the battery. You better check the battery. Because if we don't have that connection to the source, if we're not connected to God, if we're not serving not for Him but through Him, when it comes time to shine the light, you're going to click that button and say, oops, sorry, power's too low. We are called to honor God with our lives. Jesus is the light of the world. That light will not go out. The question is, how are we shining that light in the middle of the darkness that we see? If you don't like darkness, shine a light. If you don't like what's happening in the world, do something about it. If you don't like lies and the deceptions and the falsehoods that are happening, speak the truth. And I'll tell you something. They've done many, many surveys. Almost nobody thinks our country's heading in the right direction. Almost nobody thinks things are going real good for us. Almost everyone can know that there's light, but not many people are seeing where that's coming from. Everybody sees, oh, there's darkness around us. We're not heading in the right direction. And we see the light. We understand. Let's take that light to other people. We are the light of the world because Jesus is the light of the world. If we're going to shine for Him, we better stay connected. We better make sure we have the power. And the power is not us and our ability and our charisma and all these things. The power is God in our lives working through us. Let's pray. God, we thank You for the love that You have for us. Help us to understand that we are called to live for You. I pray that we will shine a light in this world, that we will be difference makers. Lord, I pray that as we recognize darkness in places, that we will shine light. And Lord, I pray that Your light will be seen and understood, and that You will be changing people's lives and hearts for the good. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.